Welcome to my channel. This is Trade Misconception. Now let's get started. I wanted to talk about this topic. It was brought up during the debates with Donald Trump and Joe Biden, but Trump was basically accusing Joe Biden of wanting to bring in low-income housing into the suburbs, which I guess was one of his plans, but he was using that to say that Joe Biden was planning to destroy the suburbs. Now, I wanted to get started on this and kind of break down this whole scenario and give my thoughts on it. So let's get started with that. This whole thing about Joe Biden, well, from what I understand, this program is actually going to be, in order for these localities to get government funds, what needs to happen is that some of them may need to accept, low-income housing in the area, building projects and whatnot. So what's going on is this has gotten a lot of people upset. Donald Trump is using this as fodder to fearmonger with people. And, this has been one of these subjects throughout history, recent history of this country, that is very contentious and very controversial. So I wanted to get into it. With the suburbs, it says the dastardly scheme for the communities where a majority of Americans live is to force suburban towns with single-family homes and minimum lot sizes to build high-density, affordable housing smack in the middle of their leafy neighborhoods. Betsy McHugh wrote in that op-ed. I really don't think this is the case. I would need to read up more into this, but I'll give you my thoughts on it. I don't think that it is a good idea to put low-income housing in the middle of suburban areas that are very car dependent. Now, I would love to see more suburban areas kind of integrate mass transit into the area itself. I would love to see more transit-oriented development in some of these areas. I know that's and this should be on a case-by-case basis. Some suburbs are so far-flung where, it just doesn't make sense to bring mass transit. But for places that are closer to jobs, places that have the density they're on that density threshold to where it makes sense to bring in that mass transit, or makes sense to increase the bus routes going through the area, then those, in my opinion, would be good candidates to start looking at the zoning ordinances there and say, okay, maybe we start changing some of the zonings. This hasn't been updated since the 70s or whatever. Start looking at stuff like the minimum setbacks, floor to area ratio in the neighborhoods. And for those of you that don't know, floor to area ratio is pretty much the ratio that someone could build. It's a square footage limit for what someone can build within a certain lot, or it's meant to put a limit to the amount of stories a place can have. So the thing is, the suburbs are changing quite a bit. And this is something that, we need to recognize right now. They are changing. They're growing. And increasingly, a lot of jobs are going out to the suburbs. There are suburbs that are already pretty transit oriented, so that is good. But then there are others that, are adjacent to these more transit oriented places that are kind of secluded, and, they don't have mixed use zoning there. A lot of it's just single family houses on large lots that ends up being very low density and doesn't really make sense for the use of space, and actually drives up housing prices in the area and pushes development further out into areas that were formerly like rural areas, pushing like further suburban, exurban development. So one thing that Biden is proposing is he's proposing to encourage these communities that have these restrictive zoning in place that maybe are in areas where it would make sense, that are, well, I'm not even going to say that because I don't even know the full details. But the whole gist of it is to sort of spread out the low-income housing so that cities aren't burdened with the vast majority of the share of low-income housing. And concentrating poverty is a bad idea anyway, in my opinion. It really hasn't worked out for cities that well. And, there's a whole nother host of topics on that where the cities sort of went through their downfall period, but now they're starting to have a new renaissance, so to speak. So let's go through it. My thing with this is I would like the plan, but I would need to hear more details about it. So I don't want to say that I like it right now because I don't have the details. I will not like the plan if they decide to put these low-income housing in just totally car-dependent suburbs, because owning a car is one of the most expensive aspects you can think of. I know if there was low-income housing in the area, that would pretty much, the transportation costs just to get to and from work or appointments wherever, that is going to eat into their budget. And for someone on the lower income level, that will not be a good thing in the long run. So, and we really don't need to add more density into areas that are car dependent, because we're just going to further congest the roads and all that. But I do think this would be a good idea if it was in areas that already have some transit options available. Now, and there is ways to do this where it doesn't, impact the area too much, because I know that is the concern of a lot of people. And there are ways that it can be accomplished where, the low-income housing is very well integrated into the community and, ends up not bringing, any problems to the community, really. So that is one thing, to research on, because I'm from a community where, that they incorporated that into like new development that was happening in the area, and haven't really noticed much of a difference at all. So one thing I did want to bring up is there already is a considerable amount of poverty in the suburbs. I think in terms of raw numbers, it's actually higher than the cities in raw numbers. So there's actually more poor people that live in the suburbs than the cities. Now, I have this article from Brookings, says poverty has long been associated with large urban centers or rural communities where it has historically been concentrated. As poverty grew in the 2000s, it continued to climb in those places, both large cities and rural counties. Okay. But the rapid rise of poverty in the 2000s touched a broad swath of communities across the country, moving well beyond its historic homes. Between 2000 and 2015, the poor population in smaller metropolitan areas grew double at the pace of urban and poor rural populations, outstripped only by the poverty's growth of the nation's suburbs. Now, let's see, suburbs. Wow, look at that. That growth in the suburbs. And it says almost every major metro area experienced a significant increase in the suburban poor between 2000 and 2015. And 2/3 of those regions now find the majority of the poor population in the suburbs. That is something to take into account. So we have to deal with the fact that the poor is already living in the suburbs. So this is already the case. And I do know it's very expensive to live in some of these hot cities. So right now you have, people that are actually, they're the people who aren't as wealthy and are struggling a little bit. They have to move out further. They have to pretty much drive till they qualify. That's something that I don't really want to see, because what it really does is it adds to the urban sprawl in certain areas, adds to the traffic, and it sort of breaks up any community cohesiveness. So that is one thing that I would like to see changed. Now, one thing to take into account is with the increase in the poor in the suburbs, you do have the factor of overcrowding in the houses. And, a lot of this is brought on by the fact that, a lot of the zoning ordinances haven't really been updated in these areas, and it's restricting the density in many areas around the city, and it's causing housing prices to go up. So there's a lot of red tape for builders and developers that would build new housing in the area, not to mention, Federal Reserve pumping money into the system and incentivizing borrowing, which we are seeing inflation on larger assets like houses. But yeah, I wanted to get back to the whole thing. This whole fear-mongering with the bringing in low-income housing to the suburbs, this has been something that is continually fear-mongered into people. what people need to realize is they're already poor that live in the suburbs. You may not know them, you may not notice them, but they are there. So that is one thing to take into account. Another thing is, if you're adding in, like, let's say lower income housing, but you're incorporating it into the community where it doesn't overwhelm the community, because again, we still want these areas to have a sufficient tax space. So you don't want to overwhelm the community with low income housing on the other hand. So I can understand that aspect of it. But this is all about spreading it out and not overburning certain localities like we have been in the past, which has been a horrible failure. So that's one thing to take into account, and I do believe that that is something that we need to do moving forward. We need to recognize that we do have a collective mission to tackle this problem. Now, one thing that will need to be done is, this is one thing that will need to be done if these suburban areas, which don't have the large tax base like some of these major cities, if they start taking in lower income housing and sort of sharing that burden across the board with, taking in lower income housing, having it built in the community, they will need to get adequate funding, because a lot of these suburban governments have fewer resources and less institutional capacity and expertise to deal with the rising need. Okay, and back to this. I'm reading this Washington Post article. They ended up fact-checking someone who wrote an op-ed about it, saying it's forcing suburban towns with single-family homes and minimum lot sizes to build high-density, affordable housing smack in the middle of their leafy suburbs. I mean, I just think that sounds ridiculous off the bat. What they clarified in this article is this is part of the Obama administration's affirmatively furthering fair housing rule. So that is what Trump repealed and Biden wishes to reinstate. What it does is it will not abolish single family home zoning. I didn't believe that for a second. That's just beyond ridiculous to even insinuate that. That's a non-starter politically for many people, so I can't even see that happening. That's just misinformation. It is true that it would require large jurisdictions that are exclusively affluent and white, because they allow nothing but single-family homes, to add other more accessible housing such as apartments. Now, this is the disagreement. My whole thing is I would want to add it based on the built environment. Now, if these areas are close to areas with other forms of transit, then that is great. I don't have an issue with that. We need to introduce mixed zoning to these areas that are just like only single family homes on large lots. So that would be one thing to, start considering, is adding in those. And yeah, we need to spread poverty. We can't concentrate it. that is a terrible idea. And I think that's a good way to increase social mobility, by giving the children of the lower income people the ability to go to some of these schools that have adequate funding, that have more resources, more programs for them, STEM programs, extracurricular programs, just better schools overall, because of the vast funding that they have and the resources that they have at those schools. So I think that would be a great thing to help out with the social mobility issue with this country. So yeah, to wrap it up, my thoughts are, good idea if they put it in areas that can easily add transit in those corridors, easily add other forms of transportation besides a personal vehicle. Then I think that's a good idea to start, looking at these areas and be like, okay, well, let's look at building some other different types of housing in these areas. Start incorporating some of that, start relaxing some of the zoning laws that are artificially constraining supply in these areas. Another thing would be to start looking at the idea of adding just some more affordable stuff in these areas while still maintaining the character of the areas and integrating it into the community and making it a part of the community. I don't want to see a 7-story apartment building next to like a single family house, but there are ways to do it that, is well integrated, that doesn't look out of place. That would be a good idea to actually look at it moving forth. But yeah, those are my main thoughts, and yeah, I do think that it's long overdue. We don't need to start concentrating the poverty in cities or, in other areas of the country. What we need to do is, allow these more affordable options in these areas that have well-funded schools and all that, so that we can increase social mobility. So that is my initial thoughts on this. Obviously, I haven't delved too deep into it, but I'm not going for the fear-mongering right now. But yeah, let me know what you think in the comments below, and thank you for watching my video. Have a good night.